Thank you and welcome. My wife and I are big fans of the National Archives and have been there many times and have always felt like it was an organization that was nonpartisan, and I hope it can remain so. Every year, though, tens of thousands of Americans travel to their nation's capital to peacefully stand up for the right to life and participate in the March for Life. It's a quintessential First Amendment activity. Just over a month ago, though, on January 20th, the 50th anniversary of the March, on their way to the march that morning, dozens of marchers decided to stop by the National Archives to see our nation's founding documents, including the Bill of Rights that guarantee their freedom to participate in the march that they were headed to. Rather than being welcomed, as more than 1 million other visitors are each year, these marchers many of whom were school-aged children, were met by hostility at the archives and forced to cover up or remove any pro-life messages. This has actually been directly decided by the Supreme Court as far as wearing T-shirts that either criticize a president or go against a political candidate, that it is actually protected speech even in our schools. You cannot force a student to cover up their shirt, and yet at the archives, they were forced to cover their shirts. In just one example of many from that day, one young woman was standing mere feet from the original Bill of Rights was told, "Cover her shirt," and her shirt read, "Life is a human right." You heard that right. The guards charged with protecting the very parchment our Bill of Rights is written on repeatedly violated the First Amendment rights of marchers in the presence of the actual First Amendment. It's hard to imagine a more offensive way to violate their freedom of speech. While I understand some action has been taken, a more serious investigation is necessary. This is especially true because similar violations occurred at the Air and Space Museum that day as well. This is deeply disturbing that this would happen. Nothing like this can ever happen again, and we must understand who ordered it or tolerated it and the culture that enabled this to happen. And lest anyone think that I'm being partisan about this, while I know of no similar violations of speech from those on the political left, I would have exactly the same position. If someone said they disliked Rand Paul and he was a terrible senator, they have their right to wear that T-shirt. Beyond the museums, the archives is responsible for preserving executive branch documents, and that mission has not been without controversy either. Federal records law should be a strictly nonpartisan affair. Unfortunately, the difference in how archives appear to have handled disputes over documents held by former President Trump and Vice President Pence and President Biden, on the other hand, raise questions about the impartiality of the agency. Specifically, the agency seems to have aggressively publicized the search for documents at President Trump and Vice President Pence's residences, but tried to keep quiet about the documents President Biden kept in at least 3 locations. Well, I think the larger issue here is that really too many things are classified, and that's something that you can have some effect on older documents on whether they remain classified. We really have to get over this. Everything's classified. In fact, it makes oversight of government worse. But even if it is classified, the rules need to be the same for both parties. And it looks as if there was a great deal of, activity on going after the Republicans and not so much for the Democrats. It was basically tea and crumpets, for Biden and FBI and drawing guns for Trump. And so it didn't seem really appropriate to many of us. In another document management matter, the archives investigated allegations that the NIH improperly destroyed key documents related to COVID. This is important because we're still struggling to get information from the NIH. You wouldn't think that a scientific organization was resisting document disclosure, but they are. The conclusion of the investigation seems to be that the archives simply accepted NIH's word that they weren't destroying records. Well, realize this is coming from an agency that you would think would be nonpartisan also, but that is resisting all of our entreaties for information. I've sent more than a dozen letters to the NIH. See, people don't know this. I've sent a dozen letters, some of them signed by 5 senators. The NIH will not give information to the Senate. So we need somebody in a nonpartisan position to say, we got to make sure they're not destroying records over there. I've yet to receive any of the documents received by these records. I'm hoping the chairman will choose to put some bipartisan heft behind this, but this is a real problem that the government is resisting records release. And I've assured the chairman that if the shoe's on the other foot and there's a Republican administration, I'll sign every document request, because there's no government agency that should be able to resist the Senate's request for information. Determining whether any documents provide insight into the origins of COVID, some of these being improperly destroyed, warrants more than just a cursory review and, okay, NIH, we're just going to take your word for it. So today I want to hear what the Archives is going to do, to ensure that records related to the origins of COVID-19 are properly preserved, as well as a commitment to provide us with all the documents related to the investigation into the origins of COVID. Finally, there is a partisan pressure campaign underway to bully the Archivist into unilaterally amending the Constitution. Who would have ever guessed that somehow the Archivist would be involved with amending the Constitution? You think people were mad over the Supreme Court deciding versus the public or legislatures deciding the issue of abortion? Can you imagine if an archivist who is not thought to be someone elected to any kind of office or creating any legislation would somehow be in charge of amending the Constitution? Would alarm even the most cautious of folks. Congress imposed a deadline back in 1982 for the 38 states to ratify the ERA, a deadline that was not met. So we do know the will of Congress on this. Lately, 3 states have attempted to ratify the amendment, notwithstanding the legal deadline. However, there also have been 5 states that have taken back and removed their approval of this. So when something this murky at best, you would think that Congress would be the arbiter of what would happen, or the people at the very least. But these activists who have conveniently ignored these 5 states that have withdrawn their ratification want the Archivist to certify the adoption of the amendment. To this point, the nominee has rightly resisted such calls, but we will be looking for reaffirmation of that today. Thank you, and we welcome your testimony.